My name is Hank Kim, and I'm the Executive Director and Counsel for the National Conference on Public Employee Retirement Systems. Today's program is part of our Center for Online Learning. The purpose of NCPERS Center for Online Learning is to provide remote continuing education to public pension trustees, staff, and other fiduciaries and stakeholders. Today, over the course of this webcast, we will review state and federal legislation from the first half of 2017, preview what may happen in the second half of this year, and discuss the impact of this fall's off-year state elections and what next year's congressional elections may have in store for public pensions. Joining me today are our regular webcast contributors, Bailey Childers, Executive Director of the National Public Pension Coalition, NPPC, and Tony Roda, partner at the law and lobbying firm of Williams Jensen. Tony, Bailey, welcome. The format we have today is a moderated conversation with our two panelists covering select state and federal legislation. We encourage audience members to participate by submitting questions for our panelists by sending an email to Amanda Rock, NCPERS Manager for Social Media and Communications at amanda@ncpers.org. However, to ensure that we can cover as many topics as possible, we will hold all questions till the last part of the program. We have a lot to cover, so let's get right to it. So Bailey, what is going on at the states?
Yeah, Hank, well thanks. It's great to be here with you and Tony again. Normally I feel like I've had good news to report on these webcasts. This year has been a little different, as we may have anticipated after last year. Not all bad, but I wanted to start with talking a little bit about the trends we're seeing at the state level, because I think that might be helpful for people to kind of know what to be looking for. So a couple of things, right after the recession, we saw the kind of anti-pension advocacy community really focusing on, well, you can't afford public pensions. Look at how low their funding levels are. We got to get rid of them. Those arguments weren't entirely successful, and in many cases not successful at all. And as pensions have started to recover post-recession, which actually the NCPERS report this year, I believe, showed pensions back at 76% of
Correct.
funding in aggregate. So that argument isn't working anymore. They can't point to that because pension systems have started to recover. Now what they've started to do is look at the discount rate. So we've had a couple of years of lower returns in certain states, and so our opponents now are saying, well, those discount rates are too high. We should be putting pensions at the risk-free rate. And there's been a push in several different states to get pension systems to lower their discount rate. What I think we all know is that doing that without having a good reason to do it just makes pensions more expensive than they need to be.
Right.
And what we've seen, actually, I just saw an article on Virginia's system this morning, I think had an 11% return, well above the benchmark. There's a debate going on in Texas in one of their systems, and the historical 30-year average they make is 8.6%, and their rate of return is set at 8%. So there's really not a reason to make those changes, but I just want people to know that's kind of where the chatter has moved a lot on the part of our opponents. So if that's something you're hearing, there may be actual reasons to make a change, but just understand there's some politics behind it as well that aren't friendly to us. Okay. Another thing we've seen quite a bit is, again, because they haven't been able to make good ground on why we should get rid of pension systems, they say, well, we should offer an optional plan, an optional 401k to workers, because that gives people more choice, and then they can do what works best for them. As we all know, a 401k is not going to provide retirement security for most working families in this country. So these optional plans are just kind of a sneaky way to undermine the pension little by little. I also, one of the things you don't always see coupled with that is, what does the education look like to a new state employee or city employee coming in if they have a choice? Are we doing an adequate job telling them what the difference is and what they're leaving on the table if they take a 401k instead of a pension? So we actually saw in Florida this year a successful push after several years of trying to move the default for new state employees to a 401k instead of a pension. And then the state of Indiana offered an optional 401k to its teachers. Pennsylvania and Michigan did some larger reform that I'll talk about a little bit later, and both of those plans included an optional 401k or the sweetening of a 401k that already existed, again, trying to push people toward that option. And then just a couple of other things to mention. We've seen local pensions in the news quite a bit more. There were a couple of really big legislative moves in Texas regarding Houston and Dallas this year. And then in Michigan, the governor had convened a task force to debate local pensions and retiree health care funding there. We have not seen the final result of that yet, but there are some people saying, well, we should just do a bill that tells localities they can no longer offer pensions. So that's a concern we'll continue to watch in Michigan. And then Nebraska, there was an attempt to have Omaha and Lincoln get rid of their pension systems through a bill. So we've seen these local attacks as well, which is just something that people should be aware of. And then finally, I'll just say the federal government this year has had a little bit of action when it comes to pensions and retirement security. So unfortunately, Congress and the president repealed the Obama era regulations that were going to allow states to be able to make it easier for states to do some of the private sector retirement plans. Now, a lot of states may still move forward with those. It's not exactly clear. Some states have said they'll continue to move forward with it. But that was kind of an unfortunate step back for a lot of people, since we know that there's a problem with coverage in the private sector. And then on the budget, the president has included an attack on federal pensions. It would workers will end up paying quite a bit more for a lesser benefit in retirement. So that's something that we're keeping an eye on as well. Most federal government workers actually are not in DC, which was, something I learned this year. But they're scattered all over the country, and so that is going to matter a lot for those folks as well.
So in terms of themes, maybe less of an emphasis on direct assaults or frontal assaults on defined benefit pension plans at the state and local level, more of a sort of an ancillary or a death by 1,000 cuts.
That's right, yeah, death by 1,000 cuts, for sure.
And then regarding the federal repeal of the Department of Labor regulation on the state-initiated plans for the private sector, one good note to take is that soon after the repeal, Vermont actually passed legislation to go forward. So,
that's great.
Yeah, so that's, hopefully that will continue, as you said. So, Tony, what's going on here in D.C. at the federal level as it relates to retirement policy?
Well, first let me say I appreciate the opportunity to be back here with you, Hank, and with you, Bailey. It's always a pleasure to talk to you about these issues and talk with you about them. On the secure choice plans, the CRA that was passed by Congress, signed by the President, it's interesting to note their legislation has been introduced to amend ERISA to provide essentially the same safe harbor that the regulations would have provided, only this would be a statutory change, which would be, of course, a much more solid footing. And Senator Martin Heinrich of New Mexico and Congresswoman Suzanne Bonamici of Oregon introduced that legislation. So just to put a punctuation mark there. It's been a very strange 6 months, and I think with the president being the president that he is and the individual that he is, it's going to continue to be a unique experience for those of us who have been around here for a while and seen other administrations and Congresses come and go. I'm very hopeful that this will not become the new normal, that we do not function this way in the future, especially with regard to our communication and our civility. I think that's very important. I would have to give President Trump and the Congress an incomplete thus far for the first 6 months. The dreaded NHI for a parent, not handed in. And what's consumed most of the oxygen is healthcare. And it continues to do so today. And there are plans out there, public plans, that have a sister trust fund that is a retiree healthcare benefit. But I think it's of importance to all plans to think about what's happening up here, and I'll give you 3 reasons for that. First is we're going to have whatever is enacted, and Hank and I were talking about this prior to the broadcast. Whatever happens, I think, will happen. It will be enacted. There will be a health care bill. People will come off the insured list, and millions will. Some of the estimates are 20 million plus. These new uninsured are going to put a stress on states and localities because they are going to seek medical care. And the states and localities are going to have to pick it up. And I think what Bailey certainly doesn't want to see is more economic and financial stress on states and political subdivisions of states. But I think with enactment and with Medicaid being rolled back, that's an inevitability. And I think that is important to think through for public pensions, because that will be used as an argument to further cut back state and local plans. The second area of interest to state and local plans has been the Cadillac tax, the so-called Cadillac tax, the 40% excise tax on high premium health insurance. And in both bills, the House-passed bill and the Senate bill, at least the initial Senate bill that has not been voted on, could be voted on as early as next week, although that's unclear. The Cadillac tax would be rolled back, the effective date, to 2025. So that's an important, that would be an important win in legislation for our community. And the third reason is the healthcare bill, as it's constructed right now, and the Affordable Care Act, included a lot of new taxes, and that's just a fact. And it's used as a political football somewhat to justify trying to repeal it, but it is true. About $700 billion in taxes would be reduced by the legislation that's currently in Congress. $66 billion of that through the Cadillac tax. Moving those $700 billion off the table makes tax reform much easier to proceed on, because you don't start with the $700 billion hole you would if you had to deal with those healthcare related taxes in a tax reform bill. So we're going to talk about tax reform a little later, and there are some reasons to view that with concern. But it will make, for the big picture, an easier path forward for tax reform. I will mention just two other healthcare related issues. There is a discussion of early age Medicare initiative, at least. There's no legislation on it. But I've been in several meetings where I've talked with congressional staff about the gap that public safety employees face. So they're retiring, firemen, policemen, at ages in the mid to early 50s. And there's always going to be that gap. I mean, some of the laws that are being passed at the state and local level are pushing those retirement ages to older ages, but you're still not going to have it at 65. So there is interest, I would say, in at least understanding the problem a little better in the halls of Congress, and trying to gather some information about what does this mean, how many public safety employees are truly impacted by this, how many don't have another plan, what would be the cost to the Medicare system. Very early stages, but it's something that I wanted to put on everyone's radar screen. The other issue is already law. It's 402L of the Internal Revenue Code. I have to throw a few code sections out there. But it is the $3,000 annual exclusion from a pension benefit received by a public safety employee if it is used for a health care premium, paid directly by the plan for the premium. And I think that was done in 2006, and I think that's just crying out for it being increased. $3,000 is not that much when you think about what health care is going to cost an individual and a spouse in the retiree years. And it's never been indexed. And most provisions, well, a great deal of provisions in the tax code are at least indexed and insulated from that. So over time, I think that we should definitely take a look at 402L, and if there's it won't happen in the repeal and replace legislation, but if there's subsequent health care legislation, then I think it's a good place for it.
And then just to underscore and put a finer point on a couple of your points, so starting off with your most recent one about 402L, the other reform would probably be to expand it beyond just public safety and do an expansion to all public sector retirees. And then to your first point about undue fiscal pressures on state, yes. I think you touched upon it, but I think it bears to make it more explicit that part of the repeal and replace legislation, they're all talking about Medicaid, right? And not only the Medicaid expansion, bringing that back, but also cutting Medicaid benefits. And as we know, Medicaid is one of the largest budget line items for most states, and so if the federal support for Medicaid goes away, then again it puts more pressure on state budgets, which then means they'll have to look for other places to cut, and obviously then the domino will go, and public plans will squarely be in the target.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think that's inevitable.
Well, so then towards that, Bailey, what are the other news and developments that happened in the first half of this year at the state level?
Yeah, so a couple of big changes. The first in the state of Pennsylvania. So they have passed a plan for new hires for state employees and teachers, and they will have a choice of 3 options. So they get one where they have a pension plus some portion of that as a 401k, so a combination plan, a hybrid plan. There's a second option that's also a pension 401k combination that's not as generous. And then there is a third option that's 401k only. So that was a big change for Pennsylvania. That was just signed into law a couple of weeks ago. In Michigan, the teacher system, what they've done there, they've closed the current hybrid that teachers were already in Michigan. They're opening a second hybrid that's going to have more of a risk sharing provision. So if the costs go up, that cost is shared by the employee and the employer. And then in Michigan, teachers already had an optional 401k to choose from when they start. And so they have increased the state contribution going into that 401k as an incentive, I think, to try to get people, teachers coming in to take that 401k. So those are the 2 big changes that we saw so far this year statewide. And then as I kind of alluded to, in Michigan, we're not done yet. So in Michigan, the governor's task force is done meeting on pensions and retiree health care, which is actually kind of interesting how that's going to work. Some states are starting to look at their OPEB and healthcare liabilities, similar to how they've looked at pensions, and it's not clear to me yet where that's going to go. NCSL actually is going to have a panel on retiree healthcare at their conference next month, and then I don't know what that action will kind of look like in the states. I mean, Michigan may be a starting point for what it looks like for other states, so that's definitely something that we'll be watching. The task force report is supposed to be final, I want to say, in the next week or 2, and then we'll see at what point they take up the legislation, because Michigan, they meet year round, so they could start working on that at any time. So again, I think retiree health also on that end is going to be something interesting to watch as a part of the healthcare debate overall. So that's what we've got going what we've had so far, and then still going this year, because it's just a never-ending year. Kentucky is expected to go into special session on pensions and tax reform. Right now, the latest information we have is sometime after August 15th. I do not expect that to be a positive special session on pensions and tax reform, but maybe I'll be surprised. And then Iowa has a study commission that's meeting, and there was a report out from Iowa this week that the Reason Foundation is going to be providing a cost-free analysis of the pension systems to the state. So while that's very kind of them, the Reason Foundation does not generally promote pro-pension legislation. So Iowa is another state that we're doing a lot of work with right now. And then New Hampshire also has a commission that meets every 10 years just to do, I think, a review of their pension systems, and that happens this year as well. So there's still quite a bit on tap for the remainder of 2017.
Okay. Tony, and then you touched upon it, if you want to expand, tax reform.
Sure, I will, absolutely. Last done, major comprehensive tax reform in 1986, a very long time ago, because it is difficult to do. Back in 1986, it was subject to tremendous fits and starts. Months and months would pass without any activity, and people pronounced it dead. And then something would happen. There'd be a committee markup, or it'd pass the House, and there was life again, and then you'd have another 5 or 6 month gap where it appeared to be dead. I think we're going to see the same for tax reform. Now, what they're trying to do is learn from the mistakes of healthcare, which I think they're still learning from each day. But healthcare, if you recall, the House moved a bill. It was the bill that could get a majority of House Republicans. There was some eye to what the Senate Republicans wanted and some eye to what President Trump wanted, but it was really an exercise to get a bill out of the House and then let the Senate deal with it, essentially. They're trying not to do that with tax reform. They have a group. We love to label groups in Washington. This is the Big Six. So it's Speaker Ryan, Ways and Means Chairman Brady, Majority Leader McConnell, Senate Finance Committee Chairman Hatch, it's Treasury Secretary Mnuchin, and Economic Council Director Gary Cohn. That is the Big Six. The Big Six is meeting regularly. And they are trying to come up with at least a skeleton, or more than a skeleton, of tax reform that could then proceed with basic agreement. The president and the two houses of Congress. We'll see if they can get there. And the timing of it's unclear. You know, it was essentially, last I heard, let me say it this way. Yesterday morning, the word was September. We won't see anything until at least September, and then maybe not in September. But then out of the White House this morning came, no, I think we're going to try to get a proposal up by the August break, which is 3 weeks from now. So we don't know, and that's a very much moving target. Tax reform for state and local governmental plans, you know, some of the issues we've worked on for many years are alive in the tax reform context, and we have to watch for and work against. Bailey spent some time talking about the discount rates. Legislation has been introduced since 2010 called PEPTA, the Public Employee Pension Transparency Act, which would require every state and local governmental plan to report their funded status to the Federal Treasury Department based on their own discount rate, but also on a Treasury bond curve discount rate, which would be probably less than 50% of the discount rate used by any plan in the United States. So PEPTA is a great concern and will continue to be, I think, and PEPTA will produce more negative headlines for state and local plans. So we have to be very wary about that. It's an amendment to the tax code, so it could fit in tax reform legislation. Senator Hatch, the chairman and one of the members of the Big Six, as I mentioned, has also proposed, in addition to PEPTA, an annuity accumulation plan, which would be a new qualified plan in the Internal Revenue Code and would allow state and local governmental plan sponsors to create or to purchase fixed rate single-year annuities for their employees. And the retirement benefit would basically be all those individual annuities stapled together at the end of a person's working career. You think about that. Administratively, it's complex, but also think about the fact that in the proposal, it can only be funded by the employer. No employee contributions can go into this. And also the employer has the flexibility to say in any given year, as long as it's done uniformly, I don't think we have the money to make a contribution this year. And while it is optional, I do believe if enacted, it's going to find its way into the state legislatures very rapidly. So there is concern about that. The push toward Roth. So Senator Bill Roth of Delaware, at the time when he served, created the Roth IRA. And the Roth IRA is a post-tax contribution that upon distribution is free of tax. And right now you can have a Roth side by side with your traditional IRA or 457B plan or 401k plan, and a lot of plans out there do that. What's being considered now is a push to make all, prospectively, contributions to those types of plans, 457B, 403Bs for our community, under the Roth rules. And there's great concern about that in the way of what does that do to retirement savings? When the dollar first hits your pocket, it competes right away for everything. Whereas if it's done pre-tax, it's a completely different psychological, I think, framework to look at that dollar. And I think that's going to be a big concern. There are other issues on tax reform. I mean, there have been a lot of cats and dogs out there over the years. There's always been the issue of consolidation. Why do we have all those various plans? Why do we have the 457Bs and the 403Bs and the 401k? Shouldn't we have one plan that makes sense for everybody? And there are very good reasons why we have those individual type of plans. But there's always been that type of issue. Another issue that has been raised is subjecting the 457B plans to early withdrawal penalties, which they are not currently. And then there's always a debate, well, if we need revenue, say we have to import some of that $700 billion from the health care bill that we don't get done. We're going to need more revenue. Where do we get it? Annual contribution limits could be lowered for retirement savings. the over 50 catch-up rule, where you can put an additional 6,000 in a 457B. That could also be sliced back. The one comfort I have in that area is that right before the July 4th holiday, Speaker Ryan made an address to the National Association of Manufacturers, and he said, yes, we're going to essentially declutter the tax code, take away special interest tax provisions. However, we're going to leave in place those that affect and incentivize home ownership, charitable giving, and retirement savings. So I think our community took some comfort from that, but there are still these other areas that we really have to pay attention to.
So Tony, what is the driver for converting the contribution from pre-tax to a Roth?
Well, Hank, I think it's a revenue grab. I mean, what you do is you first tax the dollar in the 10-year budget window instead of that dollar not being taxed and only receiving taxation upon distribution. So it generates a fairly large amount of money in the 10-year budget window. I've not seen a score from the Joint Tax Committee. I don't think there is one yet, or if there is, it's being very closely guarded. But some estimates have said if you make this mandatory, the Roth treatment, of course, it's prospective, but you make it mandatory beginning date of enactment, that it could raise up to $500 billion in 10 years. So $500 billion, and that's a tremendous amount of money. And the other driver is some of these some of the provisions that would lead to new money, for instance, the Speaker's border adjustment tax, have proved to be wildly unpopular. And it's not dead, but that was a big chunk of money that may not be there in a House bill. And then the interest deduction for corporations. That doesn't affect us, but it's a big amount of money that if it's not there, then they look for other things. And then and Roth becomes something that is right there on the shelf that they could take.
Now, you began your section on tax reform with the group of six, or the big six.
Mm-hmm.
And what I gather from your statement was that it's a very delicate dance, that a number of moving parts, very complicated, and one thing could collapse any sort of potential deal out there. Given that sort of precarious nature, is there an appetite to include a lot of provisions, including public pension proposals, or is this going to be about let's get this thing done and let's not make it, as we know it here in Washington, D.C., as a Christmas tree where you just hang everything that you can?
It's a great question, and of course left to be seen, the answer. I think that the Big Six and the other leaders in Congress that want this would like to keep it to the core provisions that they believe will incentivize economic growth. They want to keep it narrow. But when you bring it into Congress, you bring it to the Ways and Means Committee, which has, I've not counted them recently, but maybe 30 Republican members, you start to think, well, I might want to vote for this, but I do have these other provisions that I've had bills introduced for years. These make sense in the context of tax reform. They simplify the code, or they deal with some inadvertent situation and unintended consequence. So I'd like to think that, I do think that what the Big Six produces and unveils, whether it's 3 weeks from now or in September or October, will be fairly narrow. But I think once you get it into the congressional legislative process, it's going to inevitably expand. Mm-hmm. And that expansion could include some of our provisions. So we do have to be very mindful of that.
Okay. So then shifting gears and looking forward to the last 5 months of 2017. Tony, here in Washington, D.C., it's still about healthcare, it's still about tax reform. Is there anything else?
Yeah, I'll add, two pieces I'll add to that. Much like healthcare reform, and much like how the Affordable Care Act was passed originally, Congressional Republicans want to do it under so-called reconciliation protection. And that's a Budget Act mechanism. It's an enforcement, it's just a statutory enforcement mechanism that says you have expedited consideration rules if you do it under budget reconciliation. And a budget resolution has to create that reconciliation instruction. So healthcare is fine in as much as they are working under the FY17 budget, and they had reconciliation instructions. Although they are running out of time because FY17 is about to end on September 30th. For tax reform, they badly need to approve, and the budget resolution doesn't go to the president. It's just something the House and the Senate must agree to and pass in the same form. An FY18 budget resolution which will protect tax reform under reconciliation, because they really believe that is the way to do it. It's not how it was done in 1986, but it's the way the leaders believe it should be done today. So the budget resolution is a very important piece. The other thing we haven't talked about, but your question requires me to say it, is infrastructure. Because the president has promised $1 trillion infrastructure bill. And in the past, as we've seen, Hank, and we've been in meetings together on this, there's been interest. Senator Wyden of Oregon, for instance, has been very interested in trying to figure out how do we bring public pensions more into infrastructure spending. You know, it has never led to anything concrete. And it's fraught with challenges because, first of all, these state and local governmental pension plans are not taxpayers. So how do you incentivize them through the tax code? It's a little bit of a strange situation. And you do have other considerations, the unrelated business income tax, and then you have political pressures. I mean, a lot of plans have dealt with infrastructure spending carefully. And I think kind of a heavy hand from Washington might be dangerous ground.
Okay. So we'll pause there at the federal levels. And at the state level, for the balance of 2017, you mentioned what we might see in Iowa, New Hampshire. What are there any other states where we should be keeping an eye on?
Yeah, I mean, so Michigan, just because of the local issue there, I don't know, that may be dealt with this year. It may get pushed into next year. It's not clear at this point. New Jersey will be interesting to watch because they have elections this year. So they actually just, it was either this week or last week, made a change where the lottery is now an asset of the pension system. And so that is going to improve the funded level of the New Jersey pension systems, which is great. On the other hand, you know, that doesn't solve an overall budget problem that the state of New Jersey has had, as people probably saw from the beach incident a week or so ago. But the governor will be changing. We do know that. So that's going to be interesting to watch. It's going to be interesting to watch how public pensions play into that debate until November, and then what that means. Hopefully it will be a fresh start for getting some real funding commitments done in New Jersey to improve the status of the pensions there. So that'll be interesting to watch for sure for the November elections.
Okay.
And then Virginia, as I mentioned, they also have elections this year. And I mentioned their fund had very good returns. There's still been some talk at the state level of maybe doing one of those optional 401ks that I talked about, or making changes to the hybrid system they have currently. So that will be something to watch as well. That's also got the electoral component.
Okay. So we do have two off-year elections. So you mentioned it, New Jersey and Virginia. What are the things we should be looking for as the campaign starts gearing up in the second or the last quarter of this year? Anything specific that you're looking at from NPPC standpoint, and Tony from just a harbinger of things to come in 2018?
You want me to
go for it?
I mean, we've seen those. I think it was 5 special elections that the House of Representatives went through. None of those were in particularly good seats for Democrats, but a lot of hay was made over whether a Democrat could flip one of those seats. That did not happen. The situation for Virginia and New Jersey, as Bailey pointed out, I mean, I think New Jersey is very ripe for a change. Is that going? New Jersey's not a particularly red state, though, so I don't think you read much into that. And Governor Christie has his own problems, political problems.
Right.
Virginia will be interesting, and that will always, I think, be a close race. If the Democrats are able to hold that, because Ed Gillespie is a good candidate and well-known, and will have, I believe, sufficient funds to run a statewide campaign. if the Democrats can hold that, maybe you read something into Virginia. But I think that's probably what we're looking at.
I think that's right. And the other piece with New Jersey is to what extent the budget and taxation and, then along with that pension spending becomes part of the debate and how that turns out. We actually saw in Kansas this year, the state legislature rolled back some of Brownback's, very deep tax cuts. So that was, the first time we're seeing a rejection of some of the very far right pushing for very low tax, especially on corporations and folks who are wealthier. And that's going to take some pressure off the Kansas budget, but certainly not all of it, because it's been so many years of cuts and rollbacks, and people just had enough. And I think New Jersey, where Christie has done some very big tax giveaways, you've got a similar question there. Are people going to say enough is enough? And then Illinois, just last week, same thing. The state legislature overturn the governor's budget. So you're starting to see some pushback, which I think is also interesting for whatever happens nationally or federally with tax reform, because some of these quote unquote experiments that have gone on in the states are finally, people are saying, you know what, we've cut all we can cut. We've taken everything we can out of education. We have a crumbling infrastructure. Pensions aren't getting funded. So I think that's positive that we've seen this year.
Okay. Well, so before we turn it over to questions from the audience, let's take a little bit longer term view of 2018. Bailey, what are the things that NPPC is looking at for 2018? States, themes, et cetera?
I think these optional 401ks are going to continue to be something that we see, and something we've got to think about how we do education, right? Because everybody says, oh, well, choice is great. You should want to give that to people. But in this case, it's not really. Because it's not a good option for the worker, and then it also undermines the stability of the funding of a pension system. So that's something that we'll have to continue to work on. Josh McGee was appointed as chair of the Texas Review Board, and that was confirmed in the legislature in Texas this year. What he does next year with that position, I think, could be problematic for us, because he'll be able to use that platform. And Josh McGee is the main researcher for the Arnold Foundation. I should include that in case folks are new to the webcast. And the Arnold Foundation is the main anti-pension funder. So kind of how he uses that platform to continue to attack pensions, either in Texas or in other places in the country, is of concern to us. The Retirement Security Institute, which I believe I mentioned the last time I was on, they've been active in a couple of states, Nebraska being one of them. They actually were lobbying in Michigan this year for the changes that occurred there. And so keeping track of them and kind of where they're going and where they're pushing for attacks on pensions will be something that we track. And, there may be some of these debates that don't finish this year and roll over into next year. And then I think we're going to see a lot of the same, going after the discount rate, pushing these optional 401ks. We saw North Carolina and South Carolina both have some push to move to 401k. The bills varied quite a bit there and how they did it. We were successful at pushing back both of those. I expect both of those to be back next year, especially in South Carolina. I think it'll probably be a big fight. So, and then these states that have study commissions, maybe they go with the recommendations, maybe they don't, but we'll have to be prepared to respond to those. So that's kind of what we're looking at for the beginning of the year, and then I will just hope that the 2018 elections give us some friendly people at the state level.
Okay. Tony, what about here in D.C.?
Well, don't you think 2018 is all about Trump? I mean, it
Yeah,
really
for
has
sure.
to be.
It has to be.
It has to be. And it's a little bit about Congress's agenda and whether, healthcare could well be a negative, right? Even if they get to enactment, it could very easily be a negative politically for them outside of their base, Republican base. The calculation that they're going to make, though, and I think they've made, is, well, we're going to outweigh that with tax reform, and we're going to outweigh it with infrastructure and some other items that we're going to be able to take on. But the big three, healthcare, tax reform, and infrastructure, really is the agenda. And that's the visible agenda that I think people intuitively out there understand and look at. So, it's whether they can be successful on those three items, enactment meaning successful, and whether the positives of those bills, new laws, can outweigh the negatives. Now, the Democrats have a very difficult hand in the Senate. you know, a number of red states have Democratic senators up for re-election. The Republicans anticipate being able to build on their majority, although recruitment is slow at this point. And then don't know if those are just purely personal decisions. You never know why someone chooses not to run.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Or is it this overhang of the current White House and not wanting to get in that particular fight and sensing a backlash, which is usually the midterm backlash. And the House, you know, you'd think the House is safe, particular because of the district lines and how they've been drawn.
Right.
But the House is very susceptible to a wave election. And once it starts to go, a lot of members become vulnerable who never thought they would be vulnerable. So I think we've got a lot of question marks. I don't know that 2017 is going to answer too many of them. I think we're just going to have to see how the Congress and the President can complete the agenda and run on that.
Well, and somewhat related to your point about the House and the Senate, the Supreme Court is taking up in the fall session the gerrymandering case, and that may lead to some new
there may be hope
opportunities
for
or
more
questions.
competitive districts, which I think helps a lot in developing public policy and bringing more centrist candidates from each party to Washington. I mean, it can't but help. Because we have a very polarized situation right now.
Yeah. So at this point, we'll ask our audience to send questions you may have for our panelists. Again, you can email those questions to amanda@ncpers.org. So let me ask Bailey, in terms of NPPC's resources, are there any materials that you have for states that they can use as they gear up in preparation for 2018?
Yeah, definitely. So I would encourage folks to check out our Facebook page and our Twitter account. We put a lot of new material on both of those platforms all the time. It's meant to be shared. It's meant to be, you know, basic educational information about pensions, and we'd love to have you take a look and share. And if there are things that aren't there, we're happy to, you know, be responsive to what folks need and create that for them. We also, if you go to our webpage, which is protectpensions.org, and click on our, I believe we have a resources tab, I hope that's right. There's a tab that has resources on it, I think that's what it's called. We've got all kinds of one-pagers and briefing documents there that we share with folks. You know, we've got a great one that's just basic defined benefit versus defined contribution. So what are the actual differences between those two kind of plans? We don't ever want to assume that policymakers know that, because often they don't. And so when they, especially as folks are elected, so in Virginia, New Jersey, you're going to have some new elected officials after this fall. In 2018, you'll have a huge wave of new people across the country after those elections are done. We want to do the basic education on these plans and how they work and why they perform better. So we provide a lot of that kind of just easy to digest 1 or 2 pages for people on our website. And then we also have worker stories that we share there. I will say we've found that worker stories are one of the best ways to win these campaigns, is to remind people when they're starting to go after a pension system, who are the real people behind it? You know, you can get lost in the unfunded liability and the costs and all those kind of big numbers that we throw out. But reminding folks that, hey, at the end of this, there's a firefighter or a teacher or a nurse, someone who has spent their career in service to the city or state, and they're depending on their pension. And those stories have been extremely helpful to us. The press enjoys writing about those kind of people. They love getting op-eds and letters from people who talk about their career and why their pension matters for them and for their families. So you can see some examples of those on our website. We're always looking for more if people want to share. And again, I'd encourage folks, you can always reach out to us if there are other things you'd like to see.
Okay. Tony, so again, at least 2 big things, probably 3 big items here in DC, at least from the Republican agenda,
right.
But limited time. Right, we're almost halfway through July. Congress, historically takes the month of August off, and then we get into September. So, given the calendar pressures, what is the likelihood that healthcare, tax, at least those 2 big items gets done? And
in 2017,
yeah,
I think not likely that tax reform would be enacted in 2017. as I said earlier, I think healthcare, they have to clear the decks on healthcare. And it's important to move the rest of the agenda. Now, will tax reform really be ready in September, October, ready enough to have a Ways and Means Committee markup, House floor consideration, Senate, same process in the Senate? I think that's a stretch. But I do think within the 2-year Congress, I think that those 3 items can be enacted. And I think there'll be tremendous political pressure to do so, and the members really do want to run on a record of achievement as opposed to what? You know, what would they be running on? And they are in the majority in both bodies and the White House. So Republicans have to create this agenda of success. So I do think that they will be able to enact these 3 pieces in the Congress, not in 2017.
Okay. Okay. And you know, the sort of the typical, you know, election year politics and politicking, that won't get in the way in 2018 to?
It will have to be done early in 2018, I do believe.
Okay. So Bailey, you mentioned John Arnold just once this time. Does that indicate something, or is it just that you didn't have time to mention him because there were other issues?
Yeah, I just didn't have time to get into all he's doing. And I actually think it's beyond just John Arnold, so I'm glad you asked, or the audience asked. A couple things just to note. So I mentioned the Reason Foundation. They've been active this year and are about to be even more active in Iowa. ALEC, which is the American Legislative Exchange Council. It's a group of very far right, mostly state legislators that get together. They meet all over the country. They usually come out with model legislation that you see appear over and over again in states. The Stand Your Ground out of Florida, it's a pretty notorious one of theirs. But they've also done a lot of work on kind of right to work and other labor attacks that we've seen. So they have now formed a pension working group with the Heritage Foundation here in DC, and that's a pretty big concern to me because one, it's mostly behind closed doors, so it's unlikely that we're going to know what they're working on, but what it also means is kind of once they've decided, you know, here are the 2 or 3 pension related things we want to do, it's going to go out to all of the states. And so, you know, whenever that happens, you know, we could be looking at a fresh wave of attacks. So I think that's going to be a problem for us. The Arnold Foundation also had a job posting for somebody new to work on pensions in addition to Josh McGee. They've given money to RSI, which is the Retirement Security Initiative that I mentioned. So there's definitely a lot of activity on our opponent's side, even though maybe it hasn't been very public this year, which also concerns me because they're usually, you know, when they're doing those kind of things behind closed doors, we're usually eventually going to feel that. I'm just not sure in exactly what way. So those are some of the things that we've seen on kind of just the whole network of folks that push a false narrative on pensions out there.
Okay. And then somewhat similar, Tony, at the federal level, what are the pressure points that public plans should be looking at or tracking or be concerned about?
I outlined in the tax reform discussion some of the key areas that I think we have to be concerned about and work against. I do also think that we have to, and this is more behind closed doors and is a concern, is what are the regulators up to? And it's hard to know. It's hard to know when you have a friendly administration even, because the regulators, as they should be, are very circumspect about what they're saying, what they're working on. And we found that very much over the years. Even timing is a question that they can't really answer. So that concerns me. You know, 2 years ago we fought back a legislative provision in Congress that would have restricted states from requiring localities or local education associations, I believe is the term, from paying for more than normal pension cost. And I think you remember that fight that we had. And that was a great concern that if enacted would be kind of a template for, that was for higher education spending, but why not for law enforcement spending? And why not for other public safety streams of revenue that could be then constricted? So I am a little concerned about the regulators looking at some of these areas that they haven't been successful legislatively in enacting. So that gives me some concern.
Okay.
I'd also just say, you know, depending on what they do in the budget on federal employee pensions, if they do successfully go after big changes, that's a negative thing for the states as well. And it's just, you know, it'll kind of, I think people will be able to say, well, if the federal government is doing this, why are we still offering plans, you know, in the states?
And along the same lines is Puerto Rico and how Puerto Rico is resolved and the pensions there.
Yep.
Okay. Well, so obviously lots of things to keep a track of, look at for the last 6 months, 5 months of the year, and then we'll be doing this again in January, and hopefully we'll have some more positive news to report or things that are less bad. So let me close by thanking the audience members for tuning in. We will take a hiatus from our normal webinars and webcast in August, and we will recontinue that in September. And let me close by thanking you, Tony, and you,
You're
Bailey,
welcome.
for once again joining us.
Happy to be here,
All right, great. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Hank.
Happy to do it.
All right, thank you.
Bailey.
Tony, good as always.